Okay, welcome everyone. It's 3 o'clock, so we're going to make a start. My name's Simon Barrington, and just hand you over to Matthew Frost, who's hosting this webinar. So Matthew.
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this webinar. People are still joining, but we're going to make a start. So I'm Matthew, and along with Simon Barrington and Andrew Williams, we're all co-founders of WeAreCompany. It was really encouraging to have so many of you on the first WeAreCompany webinar last Thursday. We recorded the session in case you weren't there. It was on reimagining our businesses and charities relationally in a time of crisis. And we'll include a link to this follow-up email to you after this webinar. Those of you who were here last week, you may recollect that we mentioned we are partnering with the Relationships Foundation to draw on their 25 years of experience in strengthening relationships within and between organizations. And so we're delighted to have Rob Loe, John Ashcroft and Ben Gibbs join us today from the Relationships Foundation. And they're going to speak to us on the topic of how can relationships thrive when everyone is working from home. And now, before I hand over to Rob, could I please encourage you to use the chat function liberally? Please post your questions, comments, reflections, anything, as much as you can. We're trying, after all, to focus on relationships in this webinar. So without further ado, let me hand over to Rob, and thanks again for joining us. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Matthew, which is most kind. So who are we really, though, to speak into a debate like this of such great significance in these times? Well, the Relationships Foundation began in 1994. Relational Justice was our launch project. It was Lord Wolfe in his foreword to the book we published on that topic, who described relational justice as a radical new approach about which anyone with any concern about our criminal justice system needs to be aware. We worked with the Scottish Prison Service to develop our first relational audit tools. And my understanding is that the prison where that research was cited remains the only prison in Scotland, potentially the UK, where prisoners and staff still eat communally safely every day. We went on to work in healthcare contexts and published a report by the Royal Society of Medicine around 2000. In peace-building contexts, the example on your screen now is taken from the work of Brendan Bromwich in Sudan with the United Nations Environment Programme. You can download that without charge from the UN website. And now, most recently, in schools. And I tell you something of this history, I tell you all of it as reassurance, really. Our prior work across many sectors and contexts and internationally is based on 3 decades of research. This is not pseudoscience. This is the science of long-term face-to-face interaction and its impact on psychological and physiological outcomes. This research, my own doctoral research, and a significant canon of work behind it, and that will come after it, allows us to say with some certainty that relationships matter. The stakes are high. Within my own field of education, we know students' experience of school and of the relationships they encounter there have a remarkable impact on their mental health, which affects their ability to develop psychologically, emotionally, and intellectually. Face-to-face interaction affects how well we learn to read, how quickly we fight off infection, and how ultimately how long we live. Research is beginning to demonstrate that one of the main reasons women tend to live longer than men in the West is the premium they place on tight, known human connections. Digital networks have the power to make the world seem smaller, but many suggest they are no match for genuine face-to-face connection, especially in the moments of life-changing difficulty and transformation, when the chips are down. If we don't interact regularly with the people around us face to face, it impacts on our life chances, our reasoning capacity, and particularly memory. and well-being, happiness. So, for example, we know from several studies, take that from 2007, a study by Stephen Cole and his team at UCLA, who discovered that social contact switches on and off are gene responses to certain cancers, not whether we get them, but the rate of tumour growth. And these kinds of findings are replicated elsewhere. A study of 7,000 utility workers in France revealed degrees of social involvement was a good way of predicting who would be alive at the end of the decade based on who was in relationship at the beginning of it. Building quality relationships like this may seem slightly ephemeral, but they are proven to have a concrete impact on the immune system and the psyche. And that's why in 2004, a Swedish epidemiologist discovered that the lowest rates of dementia in people directly correlated to quality relationships. And 50-year-old men with active friendships are less likely to have heart attacks than more solitary men. We know more now from the field of social neuroscience than we've ever done about how our relationships affect our brains and our bodies, and how our bodies can impact our brains. We need relationships to be healthy, happy, to learn well, and to live long lives. But what do we mean by the word relationship? What is a relationship? Well, we take our cue from the Cambridge academic Robert Hind, and he defined relationships like this. Quotation's going to appear on your screen. Relationships involve a series of interactions between two individuals who know each other, such that each interaction can be influenced by past interactions and by expectations of interactions in the future. This is the very definition of what we mean by connectedness. And this very much matters in schools, in my own research. So what we know is that students need to feel connected to school. And to have this sense of connectedness with school, it's suggested that a child should feel they belong in some way. And students who do feel connected to school and feel cared for by people at school are happier, they're healthier, and they achieve better academic outcomes. We know this, and we shouldn't be surprised. Yes, relationships matter. What we also know from our own research at the Relationships Foundation is that relationships also protect. Now, don't be disturbed by this. This is a piece of our regression modeling. It's a beautiful piece of data. Let me take you through it now. I want to take you through 3 parts of this diagram. What you'll notice here, this is a large data set. There's 7,500 students in this particular data set. And what you'll notice is that they're split by their well-being. So all the children in these schools, in Australian schools that we measured relationships in, on average had a well-being using the Dina flourishing scale of 73, which is really high. But what this model does is to break down that population to tell us what is significant about those young people who had well-being that was better and those who had well-being that was worse. And what Simon did there was to highlight for us that right-hand side of the tree. And that shows us that those children who have better relationships with their peers and better relationships with their teachers, irrespective of the context they come from, whether they be a context of disadvantage, irrespective of their ethnic background, irrespective of their academic ability and achievement, if those young people have one good relationship with another young person and have one good relationship with a teacher, their well-being in our studies was protected. What you notice in the middle part of that section is those young people who, despite the fact that they had worse relationships with their peers, nonetheless had a really good relationship with a teacher. So long as they had that one good relationship with an adult, if they'd come from a context where they'd perhaps experienced bullying, irrespective of that, that teacher relationship was secure, their well-being was also protected. And right down on that bottom left-hand corner, there's with neither relationship with peer nor adult. They don't feel like they belong, and their well-being is through the floor. And we use this word well-being, but we might be best to coin the phrase well-belonging, something that a school can own and foster, and a form of capital young people can benefit from. But we see this in our longitudinal studies of professional networks as well. So when we measure relational capital in the workplace and explore whether any group of people is more or less likely to experience stronger relationships, we know that for those, and in this instance, this is teachers, with highly developed personal and professional networks, they are less likely to drop out of their teacher training programs, and they'll stay in the profession for longer as well. Well, why is that? Well, for nearly 2 decades, the programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, has been measuring belonging in schools. They define student belonging as the extent to which students feel personally accepted, respected, included and supported by others in their social environment, as well as being valued by their peers and by others at that school. That's true for children, but our studies also show that's true for adults as well. But the question is, do we need to live in a community like that, described by Susan Pinker in her book, The Village Effect, to personally feel, to perceive, to experience, to know that we are surrounded by a tight group of people whom we've invested serious time and affection over the years and who return that attention. Whilst the science of long-term face-to-face interaction is known and maturing, our knowledge and understanding of the psychological and physiological benefits of digital connection are less well developed. Our own understanding and measurement of human relationships, however, suggest there are things we can do to stimulate and simulate this experience, but we have to be intentional about it. I'm going to hand over to now to our Director of Research, John Ashcroft, to take us through our model and how we might understand relationships better in this digital context. John, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Flying blind on autopilot or without key instrument data isn't the ideal way to navigate our current circumstances. We need relationships to thrive, as Rob has said, personally and organisationally. But too often we live and work with default relationships that are the byproducts of decisions taken for other reasons. And when those places and routines, which provided the scaffolding for relationships, are stripped away, as in the current context, we do need to become more intentional. And for organisations, current data may not tell us what we need to know. Organisations may monitor aspects of their finances and performance, but they're often flying blind in regard to their relationships. The current context isn't simply one where good relationships need to be maintained when working at home. There may be also weaknesses of which there is only limited awareness, and there are new relationships to be built. But these may be new partners or staff where there's little foundation of prior relationship to build on, or the new contacts that need to be forged if work is to progress. So over the last 25 years, we've developed our idea of relational proximity as a way of bringing together insights from many disciplines and experience of working in many sectors, prisons, health, business, and so on, to provide a simple framework for measuring and improving relationships. Now, relationships are really rich and varied things, and we can understand them from psychology, sociology, economics, management studies, game theory, anthropology, and so on. So we're interested in an organising framework for all this insight that allows us to assess the extent to which the enabling factors for relationships are in place, and whether the relationships that are experienced as a result are likely to generate the desired outcomes. And it's by deconstructing the relational ingredients of trust or accountability, risk, innovation, or whatever matters to you and your organisation, that we can enable people to be more informed and intentional about their relationships. So how can we think about them? Because relying on autopilot without key data won't work. The idea of proximity speaks to many of the gaps that may emerge as people work from home. We're physically separated. So how does the way in which we communicate filter and mediate our presence to one another? Or how are the gaps in time between interactions managed to enable momentum and growth and that rooted sense of belonging? There may be gaps of information that emerge that create flawed assumptions or missed opportunities, or actual perceived power differentials, many people excluded from decision making or feel that they're excluded. And purpose may become misaligned, and with those gaps in alignment, weakening the unity and shared identity of groups, or limiting the scope of what they can achieve together. So let's look briefly at each of those 5 factors. Temporal and spatial gaps and the lower bandwidth of non-face-to-face communication create risks. And it's not just the famous military failures, such as the charge of the Light Brigade, where a message is sent by horseback over several miles to a particular cavalry unit, that are literally fatal. In our work, we've seen how splits like working in the NHS, for example, contributed to major service failures and patient deaths. Questions weren't asked, advice wasn't sought, misunderstandings were not corrected because the key people didn't meet face to face. And communication theorists look at factors as office geography, communication technology, or the relational intelligence that enables some people to listen more effectively than others. But at the heart of this is the way in which our presence, physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual, is both mediated across gaps, but also filtered by the communication technologies we employ. An example of this comes from a study of touch, relevant in the current context of social distancing, and it illustrates how we're unaware of the bandwidth we use in communication, and therefore really poor about managing its reduction. In this experiment, librarians were instructed alternately to touch or not touch the hands of students as they handed back their library cards. Then the students were interviewed. Those who'd been touched reported far greater positive feelings about themselves, the library, and the librarians than those students who had not been touched. And this occurred even though that touch was fleeting and the students didn't even remember it. It's a reminder that decisions to trust, for example, are rapid, they're unconscious, and they draw on sources that we often forget. And if the default settings of the office which enable those sources, at least to some extent, then without those defaults, we need to be more aware and much more intentional in creating them. Risks of misunderstanding can be managed with care, but any organization faces a number of communicative acts, and these are where the challenges occur when presence is diminished. For example, building the confidence of trust. Brain scans show that we make decisions to trust within 100 milliseconds of seeing someone's face. Lloyd's insurance brokers report needing to see the sweat on the brow and to get their hands-on feel for an organization in pricing hard to quantify risks. But how do we do that trust building process when we're not together? Or binding and commitment, we shake hands to seal the deal, and people are less likely to comply with decisions that are not made face to face. Honesty is also affected by the synchronicity and the record trail of different forms of communication. Or we need to work creatively. And again, research shows that task-focused collaboration may be more efficient online when a lot of the background noise is stripped out, but the lower bandwidth communication can be less creative. Or we need to show care, and we need to know that we need to show care, but the sadness of the isolated may be much less visible. And actually, what is a virtual hug? How do we communicate that care when we can't show it through our face or through our touch? A second factor to consider is time. And Rob's already referred to this definition of relationships, which have both a past and a future. And we need to recognize that that history may be a positive foundation of trust, understanding, and loyalty, but it may be a very difficult history, which is a problem. And for some people, perhaps particularly now, the future is uncertain, with some organizations and individuals fearful that there may be no future for them at all. And it's that narrative thread that links interactions and gives meaning to them which risks being broken. The project that was the reason for interacting with others may be stalled. The place where we used to meet, whether that's the office or the pub, may be closed. So that default continuity may no longer exist and has to be more intentionally created. When clients contact those disconnected beads rather than that coherent necklace, they no longer experience the continuity of relationships. And again, sticking with the NHS as an example, people have died when they contacted different doctors or other professions with no individual able to see the threads of previous interactions. It matters how we join them together. So who risks being out of sight and out of mind? Which relationships are being neglected in the current context? Who are you losing touch with? And who is losing touch with you? And what is most at risk of being lost in those gaps? Is it just information? Is it momentum? Is it commitment or understanding? The technology of CRM and tools for collaboration, just go back one, Simon. The technology for tools and collaboration may help in providing the scaffolding to support continuity, but there are two skills to consider. One is the way in which we tell and retell the story of our relationships, connecting to the past, looking to the future, but consciously locating each interaction and relationship into that wider story. But also practice those baton changes in our communication interactions. Even elite athletes, US Olympic relay teams, drop the batons. And perhaps that's particularly so when so much of their training is on individual performance rather than on the team. We need to be good at the handovers in our work to maintain the continuity of relationships. Moving on, Simon. Returning to that image of flying blind, One of the challenges is that some of the sources of information we've relied on are now off our radar. It's so much easier to have a sense of what's going on when it's observable. I can chip into the overheard conversation in the office. If you're going to talk to X, then you should know this, or ask Matthew because he's good at that. For all the intranets and knowledge hubs, people easily forget how reliant we are on informal sources of knowledge exchange, but we don't bump into our colleagues at home unless we happen to be married to them. So in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, in reference to the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we risk there being more unknown unknowns. And in the wake of 9/11, the CIA acknowledged that it struggled to join the dots of knowledge. It's hard if you don't know who knows what or what they might need to know. But sticking with that theme of 9/11, it's notable how previous crises have prompted reflection on how little we know. The banking crisis revealed the problem of debts with little information to provide reliable rating. But this memorial from the neighbour of a 9/11 victim talks to the thinness of our current relationships. I stood with you nearly every morning. We greeted each other simply with a head nod and a pleasant hello. I stood next to you for more than 2 years, and we never even exchanged names. Always that simple head nod, that pleasant hello. I learned your name after you died. I read it below your photo in the newspaper. I knew of your death earlier, though. As the search for you went on and your fate became more obvious, I'd watch your mother walk up and down the street crying. I didn't go out there and introduce myself to her either. I guess I haven't learnt my lesson. So now I'm reminded of you every day by simply looking out my window and seeing your car, still unmoved since the day you left for work. I can't say I miss you, as I never really knew you. But that's the part I find myself thinking about all the time. Why didn't I get to know you? We're accustomed to living and working with very thin, narrow relationships. But we're learning more about our colleagues now. We see their homes and their family in the background of video calls. But we may see less about what our colleagues are doing at work and know less about what's going on. Being more skilled in inquiry and disclosure certainly helps, as does intentionally creating the context in which knowledge is more readily shared with the right people. Or perhaps that's having the virtual coffee morning. But perhaps just as we spell check our documents, we need to knowledge check our relationships. Is there enough context? Is that knowledge authentic, or are we just dealing with someone's facade or a social media avatar? Is the knowledge reliable? Is it corroborated? Is it complete, or do I only know half the story? Because there are risks, the risks of the missed contributions. I didn't know you could help and didn't ask, or you didn't know to offer. The misunderstanding, I didn't appreciate the circumstances or the impact of my decision on you because I didn't know. Or the less helpful help, I didn't really understand what you needed, so didn't give you what you needed. The fourth area we look at is power. And the way that power is distributed and used is a powerful force in relationships. Used well, it fosters energy, motivation, commitment, participation, but used badly, it results in fear or apathy, sabotage or distancing. And how we use power when times are tough can reveal important truths. Do organisations use their power to squeeze others and dump costs of them, or does a value-driven commitment to fairness come to the fore? Now, Ben will touch on this a little bit more, but one issue is to consider is participation in decision-making. When there's less visibility of decisions being made, you don't see people disappearing into the meeting room, or who's making them, who's in the loop, or who feels excluded. But of course, it's worth remembering that even cabinet ministers can wonder where power lies. And this is a quote from Gillian Shepherd, who was in John Major's government. And she described power receding as you think you're approaching its source. There is no omnipotent person with that magic lever that gets things done. Even the powerful are responding to other forces and pressures. And in times of pressure, everyone can feel disempowered. When I was doing a lot of work with the NHS, undergoing periods of constant change, everyone at events resonated with this cartoon, saying this image, saying that's me, being the sort of the author, ultimately, of their own downfall. There are many forms of power and influence, and we found that everyone felt somebody else had the power, because it's easy to look at only the form of power you have and not the ones you don't have. And finally, purpose. Like the cartoon cat, mouse, Tom and Jerry, you can be present face to face over time, knowing each other well with balancing strengths, yet ultimately remain enemies and on opposite sides. Sometimes our shared or distinct identity shapes the degree and alignment of purpose, but sometimes it's shared purpose through which we form a new shared identity. Working from home can decompartmentalize the different purposes we juggle. Suddenly, work and parenthood are co-located physically. And this sits alongside the potentially multiple purposes of different projects and partners and accountabilities. And the fuzziness of our purpose. Individuals and organizations are not always or even often clear about their purpose. So some elements of purpose may be at least temporarily redundant. Roles, tasks, and projects may be in abeyance. So we need to ask, what is the center of gravity that will hold a team together? If it's not being in the room physically, then we may need to dial up other factors. And times of crisis can bring our most important purposes to the fore. Well, it's important that they're not allowed to become an all-consuming black hole that destroys the balance of other roles and duties. Helping people to hold on to a shared motivating purpose and to feel that they're contributing to something significant is an important binding force. And if the fruits of that purpose are less visible when we're working from home, then helping people to connect their work to that purpose becomes ever more important. So let me draw this together with 5 questions to reflect on. How does that way we communicate filter and mediate presence if we're not meeting face to face? Are we using email, calls, chats, and all the technologies available to us in the best possible ways? How do we make ourselves more present? Is there a thread linking all our interactions that enable that continuing sense of momentum and growth and progress? Is there that right breadth and quality of contextual information to read the person and to manage the relationship more effectively? Does the way in which power is distributed and exercised enable people to feel they are respected, that they're treated fairly, and that they are motivated to engage? And is that scope and alignment of purpose sufficient to foster a sense of unity and enable us to achieve bigger and more meaningful things than we could alone? But now, thanks to the wonders of Zoom, we're going to break into small groups for 5 minutes, and Simon is going to press a magic button which will transport you miraculously to virtual rooms where you'll be with 3 or 4 other strangers. And we're asking you to reflect together on this question about how you're experiencing relationships differently online. And we'd ask one person in the group, at least, to record some of the conclusions from your breakout into the chat so that we can pick those up later in the question and answers. So I hope by now you're in your magic breakout rooms. Simon will appear like a guardian angel in some of your chats, so don't be too surprised. And there will a button will appear in about 4 minutes and 30 seconds, giving you a countdown to leave your breakout room. So share your own experiences of what it means to experience relationships differently online.
Welcome back, everyone. And Ben, you're going to continue in from here.
Yes. Thank you very much. I can see everybody on the screen. I don't know if the slide, there we go. The slides are back up now. Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. So as John and Rob have highlighted, getting relationships right at work and enabling a workplace context in which they can flourish is a key part of improving well-being, satisfaction, and productivity. When Ryan and Decky formulated their theory of motivation, one of the basic psychological needs for a flourishing and focused individual is a sense of being able to relate to peers and to purpose. Reflecting on this, it's interesting to me that all of the focus at the moment in our lockdowns is on replicating face-to-face communication via video conferencing tools like Zoom, with little attention apparently being given to collaboration tools, or to 1 or 2 dimensional collaboration tools for workflow management. The thing that we have jumped to as most urgently needed and the most pressingly missed perhaps is human contact, even when that's mediated by technology. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to whiz through some case studies from my very recent work and study with reference to the domains that John explained earlier in our model. And I'll highlight how people seem to be finding relationships in the online workspace different to those in their offices. Now, these case studies take the form of short quotes, which usefully lead us to consider how the relational context has changed. Now, the first is from somebody at an online large group consultancy event that I was party to. Silence has a very different quality to it online. It seems more empty and tense. Is it a technical fault, Or do people have nothing to say? It might not be silence. I'll just invite you to quickly think about how silences feel in your normal relationships, both at work and at home. Are they pregnant with potential or with tension? What is it about the relationship that leads to either of these perceptions? If you can progress, please, Simon. Silence is an interesting feature in coaching, used as a means of providing time and space for a thought to form, to take shape and to emerge. It's also a key feature of relational therapies, used perhaps counterintuitively as a means of building trust and as a marker of the maturity of a therapeutic relationship. I guess the same can be said of our personal relationships. I can remember a point in my own closest relationships when silences became bearable and neither of us felt the need to fill them. We know one another well enough to have reached a mutual understanding which enables us to feel safe in silence together. We also trust one another to be fair and not to exploit any imbalance of power whilst we are vulnerable in a silence. So given all of this, what does it mean if, in the context of technology-mediated exchange like this, silence is used or experienced very differently, or is possibly indicative of a failure or a problem in the technology itself? How does this change the quality of the closeness one may have felt in silence with another individual in real life in this new context? And this relates to another comment that I found fascinating in a different context. We are meeting one another at the moment in a parallel space and relating to one another according to its rules. Will we be able to relate to one another in the same way in person after this is over? Will either of us be the same person? If the online meeting is a replica or a simulation of a real meeting, at least conceptually, because that's what we've become used to, is it real? Is it possible for us to view it and experiencing it and our encounters in it in the same way as we would in the real world? Importantly, as we move rapidly from one online meeting to another, we also have to shift from one interpersonal disposition to another and move between distinct relational models to respond appropriately as a manager, a colleague, a parent, a friend, an organizational representative, a salesperson, and so on. There's an interesting seam of psychological and behavioral research about this, about the impact of having to rapidly and repetitively switch between relational roles in these ways. And all of that research suggests that it's highly stressful and provokes significant anxiety. In terms of our model, this may be disruptive of a sense of continuity in a relationship, and certainly of alignment, with negative consequences on our feeling of belonging in that relationship and on a sense of shared identity, which we know is so key to closeness. Now, the following comment may be more recognizable still. Somebody said in that same consultancy event, this may or may not be the case, but I sense that there's a private chat going on in the background, which I'm not a party to. Another important cause of anxiety in the workplace is negative fantasy, and positive fantasy sometimes too. And again, it's clear that the quality and opportunity for this is changed in the current context in ways that are very likely to affect relationships. Working remotely, you have no idea whether the usual flavor of office politics has soured, or whether you're being spoken about in another online meeting somewhere or in a private chat. In an office, you can see body language or take other cues from other sources of data. Now, this sounds, when you hear it kind of read out in front of a group of adults, it sounds a bit adolescent. It's a bit like a playground, but we are all effectively learning how to interact in these new spaces like children. Jonathan Haidt and others talk about how social media stimulates our primitive fear of missing out or primitive fear of being left out, to which we may respond by being hypervigilant, by constantly checking to and from and across platforms and diaries. And the result is a highly stressful feeling of fight or flight, of suspicion, and the questioning of colleagues' trustworthiness, even when there's no actual evidence for us to mistrust that. I would suggest that it's important in this context for managers and colleagues to be aware of this, even more than they might have been aware of it in the office. The themes here reflect how our relationships may change when they're mediated by technology, but they also suggest that our relatedness to an organization is also deeply affected. Now, of course, the two things are intertwined and interdependent, but this is an important distinction to hold. This is illustrated in the comment, it's like learning a new language in a context where some people are on a different page and the company is working to a different set of rules. For example, even when working face-to-face, and if you can progress, please, Simon. Even when working face to face, two people can have quite different perceptions of the organization that they work for, each holding a different organization in the mind, which will have an impact on their behavior, on their priorities, on the politics and motivations. Now, people understand mission statements differently, for example, and they respond in different ways to an explicit purpose, to structures and processes, or to the implicit nuances of culture or the explicit nuances of culture. Now, I think that the differences in our held perception of the organization are likely to widen and become more problematic in an online context when there are other barriers to understanding. In some recent teleconsulting work, for example, two distinct views emerged in a staff group, which were in fact different sides of the same coin, and I think illustrate the point quite well. For one group, the organization's informal and hands-off management structure was seen as a positive cultural attribute. They themselves felt trusted to make decisions about their own work as autonomous professionals. The other group, however, felt exposed and unsupported in that culture. They perceived the absence of boundaries, management check-ins, and performance management as disinterest, and explained that it was easy for people to become overburdened and, without a system to identify this, to burn out. They were deeply loyal to the ethos and the work of the organization, but there was nobody to stop them doing too much. When we subsequently in that group began to focus on boundaries, even the first group agreed that their own concept of what had previously been normal boundaries had been changed and blurred by working in this new context, and that it would be useful for the team to openly discuss and agree now how to manage them. As if to illustrate the point, one of the mums on the screen at the time had an upset child arrive on her lap to soothe as she carried on with the meeting. And we were talking in our breakout group just now of clues that we have in the background, and I understand there might be one or two behind mine, clues that we have in the background about people that we might not previously have known. And of course, there are questions about boundaries to consider in this context. So with reference to our model, one has to ask whether inviting people into our personal lives like this and providing them with knowledge about things that would otherwise be private is a good thing. Is there a danger in enabling professional colleagues to connect with aspects of our lives that were previously separate and protected? Or, looking at this another way, what is the impact of home working on our personal relationships at home? If you could progress, please, Simon. There are a number of angles to this. In addition to the fact that we've effectively invited our colleagues into our home, is the impact of technoference, or the interruptions that heavy technology use bring to family relationships. Several studies highlight the impact of this on relational well-being in the home. For example, I was on a call with somebody earlier this week who was aware that his children were putting up a tent in a sunny back garden for the first time whilst he was on the call. It was their first time of doing that. It was sunny, they were excited, and he was missing out on it. Of course, in the good old days, it was important for most thoughtful leaders in the office to minimize their impact on their staff's home life. But that's now less easy to manage and perhaps less easy to bear. But like these other challenges, it does require careful thought and reflection, and as does the question of how can we be present online, which Rob will return to later. But first, I'm now going to hand back to Andy to summarize some of the questions and findings from the breakouts.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, some really interesting things came up there, and thank you guys for a fabulous presentation. So there's a few themes, so I'll take some of those themes out and then follow with a question specific around them. One of the key ones that came out is about visibility, or physically being able to see. Charlie and Rachel's group explicitly referenced the use of video, face-to-face, one-to-one, that sort of thing. So maybe the question on that is, with this change in society and doing everything, certainly virtually everything online, what do you think that's going to look like in 3, 6, 12 months' time? Will we revert back to type? Or do you think there are some permanencies coming into society? And if so, what do you think the permanencies will be? That's Rob, John, and you're all pausing to think, I'm sure.
I think it's really think it's really hard to tell. And I know that's a dreadfully, yeah, sort of BBC journalist response to I don't know. But the reality is, I think that there is a sense that we may just return to normal, but there is a fear and anticipation that we won't. And I think it's our responsibility to define very clearly what the new normal is before we get there. And so, for example, you know, just even aware now, as my colleague Ben just said, as we finish, just of all the things going on out here that I just want to be part of, and we need to find ways in order to balance those opportunities very carefully.
I think that there's an interesting clue in something John said around the importance of touch. And of course, touch and face-to-face communication are the things that we need. And of course, one of the challenges that the police in various countries have is actually stopping people from getting together. Yes. I think the likelihood is that we'll feel drawn to switching away from social distancing. But of course, the danger is that becomes memory, that we fear one another more. And there'll need to be some very conscious and carefully considered approaches taken both in organizations, but also in the wider social world, about how we almost kind of retrain people to trust one another after this.
One of the other themes coming through, I think, is seeing into people's personal life. So this whole concept that suddenly you're on video and you can see the books on your shelves behind you, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see pros and cons to that? Do you see it as all positive, or do you think it means managing a bit more? Mal references how he was bringing people into the conversation, so had to be more active, and a few others mentioned that whole concept of just bringing people in. So how do you see pros and cons to seeing into people's lives?
One of the themes I'm going to pick up later, but I might as well pick up now, was a conversation I had with one of our grant makers during the week, and she spoke of her utter exhaustion of engaging in virtual meetings each day, because she noted in the past how easy it was to disconnect in a regular face-to-face meeting. You can be quite easily, particularly when there's 7 or 8 people around the table, in your own world, but in this new context of heightened audio and crisp visuals, it's easy to notice those people on their mobile phones, those people rolling their eyes, or those people whose body posture perhaps signal disinterest and disengagement. And the issue there is that these virtual meetings have now become extremely narrow channels, and therefore they're draining on you if you're going to concentrate and try to the word might use it, interpolate what's going on for each person in a broader channel like the classroom, which I'm used to. You automatically know a whole load of information that the other person is perceiving: temperature, lighting, sound levels. Therefore, you don't have to do that interpolation. You only have to look for the signs of anomaly, and most of your attention can be on the matter in hand. So John speaks really eloquently in his talk about trying to teach each other some of those skills, and I think teaching relational skills will be a necessary part of this environment, but also in environments going forward. We need to pay better attention to it.
I was just going to add the kind of the psychological principle of containment is important to consider here, because previously people would seek some form of distancing or separation between their, in most cases actually, and in most cases I guess, but separation between their work life and home life. And of course now that's being blurred, and that can be provocative of a good deal of anxiety and demotivate people from working. I think the kind of the move, home working was familiar to me actually, so it's not such a great shift. But what I'd done previously was kept a very separate room, and so I one of the first things my children did when they knew I was going to be working from home again was put a sign on the door that I can flip over that says busy or not busy, so they know whether they can come in or not. And that sort of thing I think is it's important to me. It may be important to others, but it's important I think for an organisation and a group of people or a team to discuss it as options.
Yeah.
One of the key things for organizations to do at the moment is remember to provide reflective spaces for people to actually discuss how things have changed and how it makes them feel, I think.
Yeah.
I think one of that kind of feeds into some of the types of communication. So Matt's group references the formality, and a few of the others talk about the structuring of bringing it together. So maybe for John, you talked about the importance of communication. How do you think of communication in terms of it's the type of communication, whether it's to achieve an outcome or just to catch up? Because a number of people have said it's quite hard to have soft conversations, but it's easier to be quite transactional. So could you perhaps give some perspective on that, John?
Frame the purpose. So and say, actually, we're just going to have a team virtual coffee and chat. That almost you have to be more single purpose in your communication at the time, but therefore to have different bits of communication with those different purposes, you don't get it. It can be harder to get that same richness. But I think it's also being clear about what you need to do and aware of the needs of the other person, because it's very easy to drive our communication by my goal, my interest, my needs, what I want, what I'm trying to do. But actually to think, what is it the other person needs? What enables them to be present in the way that it is important for them? How can I invite them in and give them the space and the context that they need? And what are they hoping from this encounter? I mean, you have all these studies of people who have, when a company is going bust, do you text everybody so everybody gets the information quickly at the same time? But that is kind of heartless and soulless, but everybody gets it. We're closing, you're out. And you're picking on different things. So you may want that speed and clarity, but obviously you get no opportunity for someone then to come back. So is it a two-way communication? Is it one way? So yeah, I think you just have to be much more thoughtful about what you need to do and how you can make yourself appropriately present and invite the presence of the others. And we're used to relying on instinct, and our instincts may never have been that good in the first place, and people have been really bad at communicating physically as well. But our instincts and weaknesses may become even more a source of frailty and risk in this current context.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the three of you for answering the questions. I'll just reference Kate's final comment about perceptions with regards to what's in your background. And I remember last week during the presentation, I had some feedback from someone who said, someone very close who I respect a lot, who said, you need to be more professional. You shouldn't be able to see your bathroom door behind you. So there is a cultural way of doing things, and that cultural way of doing things is not going to change overnight. So Kate, totally concur, good point. So I'll hand back now. Thank you for the Q&A part.
So I think it's up to me to finish off and to try and conclude our time together. Well, I think it's really fitting that we consider an effect of working from home is the context boundaries are often blurred. Look who's come in. I think this is great. And why is that important? Well, normally we use physical locations, movement between them as markers of role and context. When we don't change physical context, we don't find it easy to switch roles. And Ben alluded to in his discussion earlier, I was that colleague whose daughter was building a tent for the very first time outside. I did miss it. And whilst I have sliding doors to my office and they're glass and I can see often through, I'm constantly aware of the things that are happening outside that other people aren't. And I do feel like I'm missing out. But as the example gives me, I don't know, Simon, where that slide's gone, you may have seen this gentleman working from home in the past. Some of you may have seen this. It's a video showing a Jordanian politician analysing an analyst doing a Skype interview for cable television that went viral on social media. His name was Majid Asfour. He was being interviewed by Al Jazeera back in 2017, but being a Skype interview, Mr. Asfour, who served as a former editor-in-chief of a Jordanian newspaper, didn't waste time that day putting trousers on for the interview. He dressed up only in a suit jacket, a tie, and propped his laptop on his lap with 2 pillows to ensure the rest of his body wasn't in the picture. But he would have got away with it as well had somebody else in the home not captured the video of that scene. There are many ways that we can think that we're hiding the really good and rich things in our life that make the relationships that we engage in, and we need to be open to how we bring those cues in. So my last slide says this, as I may have hinted at in my answer to my question, in narrow channels that need to be interpolated. That need of interpolation means concentration cannot be sustained. It's very difficult to be sustained for long periods over multiple calls. So my advice and guidance as we close is that frequency and not length of meeting becomes vital, little and often much better perhaps, and it is that sound reminder that our time is and should be coming to a close now. Thank you so much for being with us and do engage with us at the Relationships Foundation and WeAreCompany further. Here's some of the ways that you can do that. I'm going to hand back now to Simon, our host, to finish us off. Thanks very much.
To Matthew, actually.
Oh, Matthew, I beg your pardon.
That's okay. Massive thanks to Rob, John and Ben for sharing their wisdom for us this afternoon. And again, thank you to everybody who's joined in all the comments. We're planning 4 further webinars, with the next one in 2 weeks' time. So not next week. I think a lot of people on Easter break. So 2 weeks' time on April the 23rd, St. George's Day, for anybody who's interested. Taking the relational lens again, Simon's going to be speaking to us on the topic, how to work at home effectively as an individual. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you all continue to stay healthy in mind, body and spirit over the coming days. See you all in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.